The first shot rang out just as Florence Reed crossed Main Street, her hand flying to her scarred cheek by instinct. It wasn't bullets she feared, not anymore, but the eyes that would turn to her in the commotion, lingering too long on the ruined half of her face. Whispers followed Florence wherever she went in Timber Creek, Colorado, 1878. Shame about that pretty girl, they'd say, not bothering to lower their voices. Too scarred for any man to love. Florence quickened her pace as men poured from the saloon to investigate the gunfire. She kept her head down, the wide brim of her bonnet shielding her from unwanted attention. At 22, she'd learned to move through the world like a shadow, efficient and unnoticed. 6 years had passed since the fire that claimed her parents and marked her forever, but in a town with a long memory and little else to gossip about, she remained that poor Reed girl with the face. The general store bell jingled as Florence slipped inside, nodding politely to Mrs. Peterson behind the counter. "Morning, Florence. Don't worry about that ruckus, just the new marshal warning off those troublemakers from Silver Gulch," Mrs. Peterson said, arranging ribbons in a display case. "Your usual supplies today?" "Yes, madam, and some extra sugar if you have it. The boarding house has 3 new guests, and Mrs. Holloway wants to make her special apple pie." Florence placed her basket on the counter, her eyes carefully averted from the mirror hanging on the wall. The door burst open behind her, bringing with it a gust of dusty air and the heavy footfalls of someone in a hurry. Florence instinctively turned her good side toward the newcomer, a habit formed through years of self-preservation. "Marshal's compliments, Mrs. Peterson. Says to lock up if there's any more gunfire." The voice was deep, unfamiliar, with a slight Texas drawl that stretched each word like warm molasses. Florence risked a glance and found herself looking at the broadest shoulders she'd ever seen, belonging to a man who stood a head taller than most. His dark hair curled beneath a well-worn Stetson, and when he turned, she caught the flash of extraordinary blue eyes against sun-bronzed skin. "You must be Yates Sheffield," Mrs. Peterson said, beaming. "Marshal Thompson mentioned his nephew was joining us from down Texas way." "How's your uncle settling you in?" "Just fine, madam, though he's keeping me busy already." He smiled, and Florence felt something inside her chest flutter unexpectedly. When his gaze shifted to her, she quickly turned away, presenting her unscarred profile too late. She felt his eyes on her, the familiar weight of someone seeing her scars for the first time. The silence stretched only a moment before Mrs. Peterson filled it with chatter about town gossip, but for Florence, the damage was done. Another person to add to the long list of those who'd seen her at her worst. "Florence here helps manage the Holloway boarding house," Mrs. Peterson said, gesturing toward her. "Best cook in town after Mrs. Holloway herself." Florence felt heat creep up her neck. "I should be going," she murmured, gathering her purchases. "I'll walk with you," Yates offered suddenly. "Uncle said I should get to know the townsfolk, and I'm headed that direction anyway." Before Florence could protest, Mrs. Peterson had wrapped her purchases and practically pushed her toward the door, clearly delighted at the prospect of town matchmaking. Outside, Florence kept her scarred side turned away from him, quickening her pace. "There's no need to escort me, Mr. Sheffield. I know my way. Call me Yates, please." He matched her stride effortlessly. "And I don't doubt you know your way, Miss Reed, but my uncle would have my hide if I let a lady carry packages alone when I could lend a hand." Florence clutched her basket tighter. "I'm perfectly capable, I don't doubt that either." His voice held no pity, just simple honesty that made her pause. "But being capable doesn't mean you have to do everything alone." She finally looked at him fully, bracing for the inevitable flinch, the quick aversion of eyes that everyone gave when confronted with the network of scars that stretched from her right temple down to her jaw. The fire had taken her smooth skin, her parents, and what little standing the Reed family had in Timber Creek. But Yates Sheffield didn't flinch. His blue eyes met hers directly, taking in her entire face without shame or discomfort. Something shifted in Florence's chest, not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. "People will talk," she warned him quietly, his mouth quirked up at one corner. "Let them. I've never put much stock in what people say." They walked in silence for several moments, the dusty main street giving way to the tree-lined path leading to the boarding house. Florence felt acutely aware of his presence beside her, solid and unbothered, as if walking alongside the town pariah was the most natural thing in the world. "How long have you lived in Timber Creek?" he asked finally. "All my life. 22 years, she hesitated, though sometimes it feels much longer. He nodded thoughtfully. "Small towns can do that. I grew up in one much like this before I took to droving cattle." "Is that what brought you here? Cattle?" Yates shook his head. "Family. My uncle's the only kin I have left. When he wrote saying he needed help keeping the peace in a growing town, it seemed time to put down roots." Florence couldn't imagine choosing Timber Creek as a place for new beginnings. For her, it was a place of endings of dreams cut short and possibilities narrowed to the confines of a boarding house kitchen. "The boarding house is just ahead," she said as they approached the white two-story building with its wraparound porch. "Thank you for the company, Mr. Yates." He tipped his hat, the sunlight catching in his eyes. "The pleasure was mine, Florence. Perhaps I'll see you around town." "Perhaps," she echoed, knowing better than to expect anything from this brief encounter. Handsome cowboys didn't befriend scarred women, no matter how polite their initial meeting. As Florence climbed the porch steps, Mrs. Holloway appeared in the doorway, her round face alight with curiosity. "Well, well," the older woman said, eyeing Yates as he continued down the road. "Was that Thompson's nephew escorting you home?" "He was just being polite, Mrs. Holloway," Florence said firmly, handing over the basket of supplies. "Don't read anything into it." Mrs. Holloway's expression softened. "There's nothing wrong with a bit of politeness, dear. Lord knows this town could use more of it." She patted Florence's arm. "Now come help me with lunch. Those miners will be stomping in hungry as bears before long." Florence followed her employer into the kitchen, trying to push thoughts of blue eyes and a kind smile from her mind. Men like Yates Sheffield didn't waste time on women like her, not once the novelty wore off, not once they realized the whispers and stares would follow them both. She had learned that lesson all too well with Jonathan Pierce, 3 years prior. His initial kindness had given way to shame, then to cruelty, until finally he'd told her plainly what everyone in town already knew. She was too scarred for love, too damaged for a man with prospects. Florence tied on her apron with practiced movements. She wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Timber Creek had taught her that much, at least. Days passed, and Florence did her best to avoid crossing paths with the new deputy. Timber Creek wasn't large, but she'd mastered the art of invisibility over the years, timing her errands to avoid the busiest hours and taking the less traveled paths between destinations. But fate had other plans. A week after their first meeting, as Florence returned from delivering a pie to Dr. Wilson's ailing wife, the skies opened without warning. The summer storm drenched her within seconds, sending her running for the nearest shelter, the covered walkway outside the blacksmith shop. She hadn't noticed the horse tied up outside, nor its owner standing in the shadows until she nearly collided with him. "Whoa there," Yates said, steadying her with hands on her shoulders. "That's quite a downpour." Florence stepped back quickly, her hand automatically rising to cover her scars. The rain had plastered her hair to her face, and she knew from experience that wet skin made the scarring more pronounced, the ridges and discoloration impossible to disguise. "Sorry," she muttered, turning away. "I didn't see you, no harm done." His voice remained even friendly. "Looks like we're both stuck here until it lets up." Florence nodded stiffly, keeping her profile to him. The rain hammered on the awning above them, creating a curtain of water that enclosed them in unexpected intimacy. She was acutely aware of her sodden dress clinging to her form, of his tall presence beside her. "You've been avoiding me," he said after a moment, the observation stated without accusation. Florence stiffened. "I've been busy. Busy taking the long way around town whenever you spot me." There was a smile in his voice, not mockery but gentle teasing, that caught her off guard. She risked a glance at him. "You noticed? I'm a lawman now. Noticing things is part of the job." He leaned against the post, studying her with those clear blue eyes. "What I can't figure out is why." Florence looked away, watching the rain transform the dusty street into rivulets of mud. "People talk," she said finally. "Being seen with me, it wouldn't do your reputation any favors." Yates was quiet for so long that she wondered if he agreed. Then he shifted, angling himself to face her directly. "My reputation," he said slowly, "is my own to worry about, and I've never much cared what folks whisper behind my back." "You should," Florence said, more sharply than she intended. "In a town like this, whispers become shouts. Shouts become judgment, and judgment becomes your life." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. Instead of retreating, Yates moved closer. "Who hurt you, Florence?" The question was so direct, so unexpected that she couldn't summon her usual defenses. "Everyone," she whispered. "No one." "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." She laughed then, a short, pained sound. "You don't even know me. I'd like to." His words hung between them, simple and honest. "If you'd let me." Florence felt something dangerous unfurl in her chest, hope, that treacherous emotion she'd thought long buried. She shook her head. "You don't know what you're asking." "I think I do." He took a breath. "Have dinner with me, not at the boarding house, not where you're working. Just dinner where we can talk." "Why?" The word escaped before she could stop it. Yates studied her face, his gaze moving from her unscarred left side to the web of marks on the right without hesitation or discomfort. "Because when I look at you, I see someone who interests me. Someone with strength behind her eyes." Florence swallowed hard. "And these?" Her fingers drifted to her scars. "What do you see when you look at these?" His answer changed everything. "Every scar tells me who you are," he said quietly. "They're part of your story, not the whole of it." The rain slowed to a gentle patter, but neither of them moved. Florence felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her wet clothes or visible scars. "Saturday," she said finally. "I'm free after 7. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I'll call for you at the boarding house." As they parted ways minutes later, Florence told herself this wasn't hope flickering in her chest. It was merely curiosity, a brief diversion from the settled pattern of her days. Nothing would come of it, nothing could come of it, but perhaps for one evening she could pretend that scars didn't matter and that whispers couldn't reach her. Word traveled fast in Timber Creek. By midday, Florence had endured knowing looks from Mrs. Holloway, pointed questions from the boarding house guests, and the barely concealed surprise of Mr. Edwards at the mercantile when she purchased a length of blue ribbon for her hair. "Got yourself a gentleman caller, I hear," he said, measuring out the ribbon. "Thompson's nephew, no less." Florence kept her expression neutral. "We're just having dinner, Mr. Edwards." "Course you are," he winked, cutting the ribbon with a flourish. "Been a while since you stepped out with anyone. Good to see you not letting the past hold you back." She took the ribbon without responding, tucking it into her basket alongside the mending she'd collected from the dressmaker. Everyone would be watching on Saturday, waiting to see if the handsome new deputy would actually court the scarred Reed girl, or if this was some kind of misplaced pity. Florence herself wasn't sure which it was, and that uncertainty followed her through the remainder of the week, through her chores and cooking and the quiet hours after the boarding house settled for the night. She found herself standing before the small mirror in her room, trying to see whatever Yates claimed to see when he looked at her face. The scars hadn't faded much over the years, a map of pain etched into her skin, pulling her right eye slightly downward, twisting the corner of her mouth into a permanent slight grimace. The flames had spared her eye itself, and most of her hair, small mercies in the aftermath of tragedy. Florence had once been considered pretty in the way of small-town girls with regular features and a ready smile. Now, she was a curiosity at best, an object of pity at worst. She'd learned to live with the stares, had built a life within the limitations imposed by other people's discomfort. It wasn't the life she'd dreamed of as a girl, but it was hers. And now Yates Sheffield threatened to disrupt it all with his blue eyes and unexpected kindness. Saturday arrived with golden summer sunshine and a knot of anxiety in Florence's stomach that tightened with each passing hour. She found herself unusually clumsy, breaking a cup at breakfast and oversalting the midday stew. "Go rest," Mrs. Holloway finally ordered, shooing her from the kitchen. You're more hindrance than help today. Take some time to prepare for your evening. Preparing proved to be its own challenge. Florence's wardrobe was modest and practical, with few concessions to fashion or vanity. She eventually settled on her best dress, a deep green cotton with covered buttons down the front and a lace collar that had belonged to her mother. The blue ribbon became a band for her dark hair, which she arranged to fall softly around the scarred side of her face without obviously hiding it. At precisely 7, Mrs. Holloway called up the stairs. "Florence, your young man is here." Florence descended slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Yates stood in the entryway, hat in hand, wearing a clean shirt and vest beneath his usual duster. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her, and for a terrible moment she thought he was reconsidering the entire evening. Then he smiled, warm and genuine. "You look beautiful." The words hung in the air, honest and unqualified, not beautiful despite, or still beautiful even though, just beautiful, full stop. "Thank you," she managed, heat rising in her cheeks. "You look very nice yourself." Mrs. Holloway beamed at them both, practically vibrating with approval. "Don't keep her out too late, Deputy, though I suspect Florence is in safe hands with a lawman." "Yes, madam," Yates replied seriously, though his eyes held a glint of humor. "I'll have her back at her respectable hour." He offered Florence his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. The solid warmth of him beneath her fingers felt foreign yet somehow right. Outside, a buggy waited, hitched to a handsome bay horse. "I borrowed it from Uncle James," Yates explained, helping her up to the seat. "Thought we might drive out to Widow Parker's place. She runs a small restaurant out of her home just outside town, more private than the hotel dining room." Florence was grateful for his thoughtfulness. The prospect of enduring an entire meal under the scrutiny of the town's most dedicated gossips had been the one shadow on her anticipation. As they drove through town, Florence kept her head high despite the stares that followed them. Yates seemed oblivious to the attention, conversing easily about the weather, his work with the marshal, and his impressions of Timber Creek. "It reminds me of home in some ways," he said, guiding the horse along the road that led out of town. "Same kind of folk, hardworking, set in their ways but good at heart." "And judgmental," Florence added softly. "Don't forget that part." Yates glanced at her. "Some maybe, but I've found most people take their cues from how you carry yourself. Walk tall like you've nothing to be ashamed of, and eventually they forget to question why they ever thought you should be." Florence considered his words as they traveled the winding dirt road toward the Parker homestead. The evening air was sweet with summer blossoms, and in the distance, the mountains were turning purple with approaching dusk. "Is that what you think I should do? Pretend the stairs don't exist?" Her voice held no bitterness, only genuine curiosity. Yates slowed the horse, choosing his words carefully. "Not pretend. Acknowledge, then dismiss. Their opinions aren't facts, Florence, they're just opinions." She'd never considered it that way before. In her mind, the town's judgment had hardened into immutable truth over the years. She was damaged, undesirable, an object of pity rather than desire. But sitting beside Yates as the sunset painted the world in gold, another perspective seemed possible, if not quite believable. Widow Parker's home was a neat white farmhouse set back from the road, with lanterns already glowing in the windows. The smell of roasting meat and fresh bread greeted them as they approached, along with the widow herself, a tiny woman with iron gray hair and bright, shrewd eyes. "Deputy Sheffield." "Right on time," she called, wiping her hands on her apron. "And Miss Reed, my, don't you look lovely this evening? That green suits you beautifully." Florence blinked in surprise at the genuine warmth in the older woman's voice. She'd met Mrs. Parker only in passing over the years, their interactions limited to brief exchanges at church or the general store. "Thank you for having us," Florence said, feeling strangely shy. "Nonsense, it's my pleasure. Business has been slow lately. Most folks don't bother coming out this far for a meal when the hotel serves decent food." She ushered them inside to a small dining room where a table had been set for two, complete with candles and wildflowers in a blue glass vase. The intimate setting made Florence's heart flutter. This was no casual dinner between acquaintances. Yates had arranged a proper courtship outing, complete with privacy and romantic touches. Mrs. Parker served them herself tender roast beef, garden vegetables, fresh baked bread, and blackberry cobbler still warm from the oven. The food was delicious, but Florence found herself too nervous to eat much, especially when she noticed Yates watching her with those intent blue eyes. "Tell me about yourself," he said as Mrs. Parker tactfully retreated to the kitchen. "Not what happened to you, I'll listen if you want to share that, but I want to know who you are, what you like, what makes you smile." The question caught her off guard. For years, people had defined her by her tragedy, the fire, her scars, her lost parents. No one had bothered to look beyond that narrative to the person she'd become. "I love books," she said finally. "Novels, poetry, history, anything I can get my hands on. Mrs. Holloway lets me borrow from her collection, and sometimes Dr. Wilson loans me medical texts when I express interest." Yates nodded encouragingly. "What else?" "I like to cook, not just because it's my job, but because there's something satisfying about creating something that brings others pleasure." She hesitated, then added, "And I like autumn best of all the seasons. The colors, the crisp air, the way the world changes so dramatically yet so beautifully." "Do you miss having family?" he asked quietly. Florence looked down at her plate. "Every day, but Mrs. Holloway has been kind. She took me in when no one else would, gave me purpose when I thought I had none left." "You were how old when the fire happened?" 16. The word hung between them, heavy with unspoken pain. "Old enough to survive alone, young enough to feel completely lost." Yates reached across the table, his hand open in invitation. After a moment's hesitation, Florence placed her fingers in his. His palm was warm, calloused from work, strong yet gentle as it closed around her smaller hand. "I lost my parents too," he said. "Not as young as you, I was 20 when fever took them both within a week of each other. It leaves a hole nothing quite fills." Florence nodded, a lump in her throat preventing speech. This unexpected connection, shared loss, shared understanding felt more intimate than any physical touch. "What about you?" she asked when she could trust her voice again. "What brings you joy, Yates Sheffield?" His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand as he considered. "Open spaces. The sky at dawn, a good horse beneath me," he smiled. "And now I think I might add conversation with Florence Reed to that list." She blushed, unused to such direct compliments. "You're very kind, not kind," he corrected gently. "Honest, there's a difference." After dinner, they sat on Widow Parker's porch swing while their hostess puttered inside, giving them privacy while maintaining propriety with her presence in the house. The night was clear, stars emerging in a velvet sky, the air sweet with honeysuckle from the vine climbing the porch trellis. "Why did you really ask me to dinner?" Florence finally found the courage to ask the question that had lingered since their encounter in the rain. Yates was quiet for a moment, rocking the swing gently with one foot. "The first time I saw you in the general store, you wouldn't look at me directly. You angled yourself away, trying to hide. But then Mrs. Peterson said something that made you smile just for a second, and I caught a glimpse of something luminous." Florence listened, hardly breathing. "Then I saw how people whispered when you passed, how you held yourself like someone braced for a blow that never stops coming." His voice remained steady, matter of fact. "I wanted to know the woman who could endure that every day and still find reasons to smile, even fleetingly. And now," she whispered, "now that you've spent an evening with me." Yates turned to face her fully, no longer allowing her to hide the scarred side of her face. In the soft lantern light, he studied her without pretense or discomfort. "Now I want to spend more evenings with you," he said simply. "If you'll allow it." Florence felt tears prick behind her eyes. "People will talk more than ever. Let them." His hand found hers again, strong fingers interlacing with her own. "Unless their talk bothers you," she considered the question honestly. "It always has, but tonight." "Tonight it bothered me less." He smiled, and something inside Florence's chest unfurled like a flower reaching for sunlight. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was room in her carefully constructed life for something she'd thought forever beyond her reach. The next few weeks passed in a blur of cautious joy for Florence. True to his word, Yates called on her regularly, accompanying her on errands, sharing Sunday dinner at the boarding house, taking her for drives in the borrowed buggy. Each encounter left her feeling more alive than she had in years, as if she'd been existing in shadow and had suddenly stepped into light. The town's reaction evolved from shocked whispers to reluctant acceptance. Some, like Mrs. Holloway and Dr. Wilson, seemed genuinely pleased to see Florence emerging from her self-imposed isolation. Others maintained their distance, as if her scars might somehow be contagious. A few, like Beatrice Whitman and her sharp-tongued friends, made little attempt to hide their disbelief that someone like Yates would court someone like Florence without ulterior motives. "He's just passing time until someone better comes along," Florence overheard Beatrice saying one afternoon at the Mercantile. "Or maybe he lost a bet. Men like that don't seriously court scarred spinsters unless there's something wrong with them too." The words stung, but not as deeply as they once might have. Florence finished selecting her purchases and approached the counter where Beatrice and her friends stood gossiping. "Good afternoon, ladies," she said calmly, placing her items before Mr. Edwards. "Lovely day, isn't it?" Beatrice had the grace to flush pink, though her eyes remained cold. "Indeed, Deputy Sheffield not escorting you today. He seems quite attentive lately." "He's working," Florence replied, counting out coins for her purchases. "The marshal has them both busy with that business over at the mining camp." Mr. Edwards nodded sagely. "Nasty business that. 3 men hurt in that collapse and now talk of sabotage. Good thing we've got Thompson and Sheffield looking into it." Florence's heart clenched. Yates had mentioned the mine incident but downplayed any danger. She'd been so wrapped up in her own concerns that she hadn't pressed him for details. "Is it dangerous?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Mining camp's always dangerous," Mr. Edwards said with a shrug. "But word is some of those miners from the northern camp have been making threats. Bad blood between the owners." He wrapped her purchases in brown paper. "Sheffield can handle himself, though. Saw him break up that fight at the saloon last week without even drawing his gun." "Man knows how to command respect," Florence nodded, gathering her packages. As she turned to leave, Beatrice stepped closer, her voice pitched for Florence's ears only. "He'll tire of you, you know. Men always do. Especially when there's a visible reminder of what they're settling for every time they look at you." Florence met the other woman's gaze steadily. 6 weeks ago, the cruel words would have cut to her core, confirming her deepest fears. Now, they revealed more about Beatrice than they did about Florence's relationship with Yates. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Florence said quietly. "It must be difficult, seeing the world through such a bitter lens." She left Beatrice sputtering behind her, a small victory that carried her all the way back to the boarding house. Only there, in the privacy of her room, did she allow herself to examine the seed of doubt Beatrice had planted. Was she being naive? Would Yates eventually tire of the stares, the whispers, the constant reminder that his choice of companion didn't meet the town's standards? Florence was still pondering this question that evening as she sat on the boarding house porch, shelling peas for tomorrow's dinner. The sunset painted the western sky in shades of orange and pink, and cicadas had begun their evening chorus from the trees. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the road, where a familiar figure on horseback approached. Her heart leapt at the sight of Yates, then faltered when she noticed how he slumped slightly in the saddle. She set aside her work and hurried to meet him as he dismounted stiffly at the hitching post. Up close, she could see the exhaustion in his face and the dust that covered his clothes. "Are you all right?" she asked, hands hovering uncertainly near his arm. Yates attempted a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nothing that won't heal. Long day tracking those troublemakers from the northern camp. They didn't take kindly to being found." Florence's eyes widened as she noticed the dried blood on his shirt sleeve. "You're hurt." He glanced down as if surprised. "It's just a graze. Uncle James patched it up well enough." "Come inside," she said firmly, all earlier doubts forgotten in the face of his injury. "Mrs. Holloway always keeps the kettle on, and you look like you could use something hot to drink." Too tired to argue, Yates followed her into the boarding house kitchen, where Florence quickly poured him coffee and warmed up leftover stew from dinner. He ate quietly while she hovered nearby, relief and concern warring within her. "I heard there was trouble at the mine," she said finally. "Mr. Edwards mentioned it might be dangerous." Yates set down his spoon, studying her face. "Are you worried about me, Florence Reed?" The question was gently teasing, but she answered honestly. "Yes." Something softened in his expression. "It's part of the job, but I'm careful I have good reasons to come back safe now." The simple statement warmed her more than she could express. Instead of trying, she refilled his coffee cup and sat across from him at the kitchen table. "Tell me about your day," he said, stretching out his long legs. "Something normal and peaceful to wash away the dust of chasing outlaws." So Florence told him about her mundane activities, the bread she'd baked, the mending she'd finished for Mrs. Holloway, the letter she'd written to her mother's cousin in Denver. She hesitated when she came to her encounter with Beatrice, unsure whether to share it. Yates noticed her pause. "What is it?" Florence sighed. "Just more of the usual, Beatrice Whitman and her friends speculating on why you might be spending time with me." A muscle tightened in his jaw. That woman needs more to occupy her mind than other people's business. "She said you'd tire of me," Florence admitted quietly. "That men always do when there's a visible reminder of what they're settling for." Yates set down his cup with enough force that coffee sloshed over the rim. "Beatrice Whitman doesn't know the first thing about me or what I value." His voice was low, controlled, but Florence could hear the anger beneath it. "It's a reasonable concern," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "This isn't easy for you, Yates, being seen with me, enduring the whispers and stares. Is that what you think?" He leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. "That I'm enduring something by being with you, that I'm making some noble sacrifice." Florence looked down at her hands. "I wouldn't blame you if—" "Look at me," he interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. When she raised her eyes to his, he continued. "In the weeks I've known you, I've discovered a woman of intelligence, kindness, and quiet strength. A woman who reads medical text for pleasure and remembers how every boarder likes their eggs prepared. A woman who survived tragedy that would have broken many, yet still finds joy in small moments." He reached across the table to take her hand. "I'm not settling, Florence. I'm not enduring. I'm choosing every day to spend time with someone who makes me feel more alive, more myself than I've felt in years." Tears prickled behind Florence's eyes. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "Of what?" "Of believing you, of hoping, of finding out months or years from now that Beatrice was right." Yates stood, drawing her to her feet and into the circle of his arms. It was the first time he'd held her so close, and Florence's breath caught at the solid warmth of him, the gentle strength in the arms that encircled her. "I can't promise what years will bring," he said, his voice a low rumble she could feel against her cheek. "No one can. But I can promise that my feelings aren't dependent on what others think, and they certainly aren't affected by scars that only tell me you're a survivor." Florence allowed herself to lean into his embrace, to accept the comfort and connection he offered. This tentative happiness still felt fragile, but in Yates's arms, she could almost believe it might endure. Summer faded into autumn, Florence's favorite season, bringing crisp mornings and golden afternoons. Her relationship with Yates deepened with each passing week, their connection growing from cautious friendship to something neither could deny was love, though the word itself remained unspoken between them. They established routines: Sunday walks after church, Wednesday evenings reading together on the boarding house porch, impromptu picnics when Yates's duties allowed. Florence found herself smiling more often, laughing more freely, and walking through town with her head held higher. The whispers hadn't stopped entirely, but they'd lost their power to wound her. Even Beatrice Whitman had grudgingly ceased her most cutting remarks, especially after Yates pointedly escorted Florence to the Harvest Festival dance, while Beatrice sat without a partner for most of the evening. "You've bloomed like a flower these past months," Mrs. Holloway remarked one morning as they worked side by side in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for the boarders. "Love suits you, my dear." Florence felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I don't know that it's love exactly." Mrs. Holloway chuckled, her plump hands expertly kneading bread dough. If that young man doesn't love you, then I'm the Queen of England. I see how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. The observation sent a pleasant warmth through Florence. She had begun to trust in Yates's affection, to believe that his feelings for her were genuine and lasting. Still, a lifetime of caution made her hesitant to fully embrace hope. That afternoon, as Florence returned from delivering meals to several elderly residents who lived alone, she noticed unusual activity around the marshal's office. A crowd had gathered, and the atmosphere felt tense, expectant. She approached cautiously, scanning the faces for Yates or Marshal Thompson. Instead, she spotted Mrs. Peterson wringing her hands at the edge of the group. "What's happening?" Florence asked, touching the older woman's arm. Mrs. Peterson jumped slightly. "Oh, Florence. It's those troublemakers from the northern mining camp again. They've taken over the Silver Dollar Mine, holding the foreman hostage. The marshal and Deputy Sheffield rode out with a posse an hour ago." Florence's heart seemed to stop, then restart at a gallop. "Is it dangerous?" "Word is they're armed and desperate. The mine's been failing, and they blame the owner for cheating them of wages." Mrs. Peterson clutched Florence's hand. "They're saying shots were already fired before the marshal got there." Cold fear washed over Florence. She thought of Yates riding into danger, perhaps at that very moment facing armed, desperate men. She had already lost so much: her parents, her beauty, years of her life to grief and isolation. The thought of losing Yates too was unbearable. "I need to go," she whispered, pulling away from Mrs. Peterson's grasp. "Where? You can't go to the mine, Florence. It's too dangerous and you'd only be in the way." But Florence was already moving, not toward the mine but to the boarding house. If she couldn't be with Yates, she could at least pray for his safe return and prepare for whatever might come after. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Florence went through the motions of her usual tasks, preparing dinner for the boarders, setting the table, keeping the coffee hot, but her mind was miles away, imagining terrible scenarios at the Silver Dollar Mine. Just after sunset, as Florence was mechanically washing dishes, the sound of horses approaching drew her to the window. Her heart leapt at the sight of riders coming down the main street, then plummeted when she counted only 5 where 6 had departed. She dried her hands on her apron and hurried to the front porch, straining to see in the gathering dusk. Relief flooded her when she spotted Yates among the returning men, though he rode slumped in his saddle, one arm held at an awkward angle. Without thinking, Florence lifted her skirts and ran toward the approaching riders, heedless of propriety or the stares of townspeople gathering to hear news of the confrontation. "Yates," she called, reaching his horse just as the group halted before the marshal's office. He looked down at her, his face gray with pain but his eyes warming at the sight of her. "Florence, shouldn't you be running toward danger, not toward it? Are you hurt?" she demanded, ignoring his attempt at humor. Marshal Thompson answered as he dismounted stiffly. "Took a bullet in the shoulder. Doc Wilson's waiting at his office. That's our next stop." Florence reached up instinctively, and Yates leaned down from his saddle to grasp her hand. "I'm all right," he said quietly. "It went clean through. Looks worse than it is." "I'll come with you," she said, her voice brooking no argument. To her surprise, neither Yates nor his uncle objected. Marshal Thompson simply nodded, and one of the other men helped Yates dismount, supporting him as they made their way to the doctor's office with Florence at their side. The next hour passed in a blur of anxiety as Dr. Wilson cleaned and bandaged Yates's wound, declaring him lucky that the bullet had indeed passed through muscle without hitting bone or vital organs. Florence remained by his side throughout, holding his hand during the painful cleaning, murmuring encouragement when he gritted his teeth against the sting of antiseptic. "He'll need rest and care for at least a week," Dr. Wilson finally announced, wiping blood from his hands. "No riding, no exertion, and someone should check the wound daily for signs of infection." "He can stay at the boarding house," Florence said immediately. "We have an empty room on the ground floor and I can tend to his needs." Marshal Thompson raised an eyebrow but nodded after a moment's consideration. "Makes sense. I'm getting too old to play nursemaid, and my quarters above the jail aren't exactly restful." He glanced between Florence and his nephew. "Mrs. Holloway would be there to ensure propriety, I assume." "Of course," Florence assured him, cheeks warming at the implication. "Everything would be entirely proper." And so it was arranged. Yates was installed in the small room off the boarding house parlor, with Florence appointed as his primary caregiver. Mrs. Holloway, far from objecting, seemed delighted by the arrangement, though she made a show of leaving doors open and chaperoning their interactions when decorum required it. For Florence, the week that followed was both frightening and precious. Frightening because Yates developed a fever on the second night that had her sitting by his bedside until dawn, bathing his brow with cool cloths and praying as she hadn't since her parents' deaths. Precious because, in his lucid moments, their conversations reached new depths of honesty and intimacy. "I saw my life flash before my eyes when that bullet hit," Yates told her on the third evening, his fever finally broken and color returning to his face. "And do you know what my biggest regret would have been if it had been fatal?" Florence shook her head, her throat tight with emotion. "That I hadn't told you I love you." His blue eyes held hers, clear and earnest. "I do, Florence Reed. I love your kindness and your courage. I love how you see beauty in simple things. I love how you've let me into your life despite every reason to guard your heart." Florence felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I love you too," she whispered, the words she'd held back for so long finally finding voice. "I've been so afraid to say it, to believe it could last, but these past days, thinking I might lose you. Nothing else matters but this, what we feel for each other." Yates reached for her hand, drawing it to his lips. "When I'm recovered, there's something I want to ask you, something important." Florence's heart fluttered with hope and anticipation. "I'll be ready to answer." By the time Yates was well enough to return to light duties at the marshal's office, autumn was painting the mountains in brilliant hues of red and gold. Florence had grown accustomed to caring for him, to having him as a constant presence at the boarding house. His absence during the day left her feeling strangely bereft, though she knew it was a sign of his recovery. On the first truly cool evening of the season, Yates invited Florence for a sunset ride to their favorite spot overlooking the valley. His shoulder was nearly healed, and Dr. Wilson had finally cleared him for riding, much to his relief. "Bundle up," he advised when he arrived with the buggy. "The wind has a bite to it today." Florence wrapped herself in her warmest shawl and allowed him to help her into the buggy, noting how he moved with almost his old ease and strength. They traveled the familiar road out of town in comfortable silence, the landscape around them ablaze with autumn color. Their destination was a small clearing atop a gentle rise, offering a panoramic view of Timber Creek and the surrounding valley. It had become their special place over the summer months, a refuge from prying eyes where they could talk freely or simply enjoy each other's company. Today, Yates seemed unusually quiet, almost nervous as he spread a blanket for them to sit on and helped Florence arrange her skirts. "Is your shoulder bothering you?" she asked, concerned by his distraction. He shook his head, smiling slightly. "No, it's healing well. I'm just thinking." "About what?" Instead of answering directly, Yates took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Do you remember the first time we really talked, under the blacksmith's awning during that sudden downpour?" Florence nodded, warmth spreading through her at the memory. "You asked me to dinner. I thought you were being kind. And I told you there's a difference between kindness and honesty." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I want to be honest with you now, Florence, about what I see when I look at you." She tensed slightly, old insecurities rising despite everything they'd shared. Yates must have felt it because he squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I see your scars," he said quietly. "I don't pretend they're not there, but what I told you months ago remains true. Every scar tells me who you are. They tell me you're a survivor. They tell me you've faced the worst life can offer and emerged with your capacity for kindness intact. They're marks of a journey, not definitions of worth." Florence's eyes filled with tears as he continued, his voice steady and sure. "When I look at you, I see the future I want, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine love. A home filled with conversation and laughter. Children, perhaps, who will grow up knowing that true beauty lies in character, not appearance. With his free hand, Yates reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Florence's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a simple gold ring set with a single pearl. "Florence Reed," he said, his blue eyes holding hers with unmistakable love, "will you marry me? Will you build that future with me, scars and all, facing whatever life brings together?" For a moment, Florence couldn't speak, overwhelmed by emotion. This man, this kind, honorable, perceptive man saw beyond her scars to the person she truly was and loved her completely. The realization was like sunrise after the longest night, illuminating possibilities she'd thought forever close to her. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Yates Sheffield, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a tender kiss, their first that promised a lifetime of love and understanding. As they drove back to town in the gathering dusk, Florence nestled against Yates's side, her scarred cheek resting trustingly against his shoulder. For the first time since the fire that had claimed so much from her, she felt truly whole, truly seen. The whispers would continue, she knew. There would always be those like Beatrice Whitman who couldn't understand what Yates saw in her. But those voices no longer mattered. What mattered was the man beside her who had taught her that every scar told a story worth hearing and that hers was far from over. Winter came early to Timber Creek that year, bringing swirling snow and crisp, cold days that kept most townspeople close to their hearths. For Florence and Yates, the changing season brought a flurry of wedding preparations, overseen with enthusiastic guidance from Mrs. Holloway and Marshall Thompson. "December wedding," Mrs. Holloway declared, "just before Christmas. The church will already be decorated with evergreens and candles perfect for a bride." Florence had agreed, touched by the older woman's excitement. Mrs. Holloway had been more than an employer over the years. She'd been the closest thing to family Florence had left. That she would give Florence away at the ceremony seemed only fitting. News of their engagement had spread through town with predictable reactions, genuine congratulations from some, poorly disguised surprise from others, and a few outright expressions of disbelief. Beatrice Whitman had sniffed audibly when told, remarking that some men have unusual tastes before flouncing away. Her words had no power to hurt Florence anymore. More surprising was the letter that arrived from Denver 2 weeks after Yates's proposal. Florence's mother's cousin, Harriet Simmons, whom Florence hadn't seen since childhood, wrote expressing delight at news of the engagement and enclosing a generous check to help with wedding expenses and setting up your household. "I had no idea Cousin Harriet even remembered me," Florence said, showing the letter to Yates as they sat by the fireplace in the boarding house parlor one evening. "Mother corresponded with her, but after the fire. People have a way of surprising you," Yates replied, squeezing her hand. "For better or worse." The money from Cousin Harriet allowed Florence to order a proper wedding dress from Denver ivory satin with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, more elegant than anything she'd ever owned. When it arrived, she stood before the mirror in her room, examining her reflection with new eyes. The scars remained, of course. Nothing would ever erase them, but they no longer dominated her self-image as they once had. Instead, Florence saw what Yates claimed to see: a woman of strength and dignity, scarred but not defined by those scars, beautiful in ways that mattered. 3 days before the wedding, as snow fell in thick, lazy flakes outside, Florence sat in the boarding house kitchen rolling out dough for Christmas cookies. Mrs. Holloway had gone to visit her sister in the next town over, leaving Florence temporarily in charge of the establishment and its 5 current boarders. The sound of the front door opening and closing, followed by heavy footsteps shaking off snow, brought a smile to her face. Yates had promised to stop by after his rounds, and she looked forward to sharing the fresh cookies with him. But when she looked up, it wasn't Yates standing in the kitchen doorway. It was Jonathan Pierce, Florence's hands stilled on the rolling pin. She hadn't seen Jonathan in nearly 2 years. not since he'd left Timber Creek to seek his fortune in the goldfields further west. He looked older, more weathered, but still handsome in the conventional way that had once made him the most eligible bachelor in town and made his rejection of Florence all the more humiliating. "Jonathan," she said, keeping her voice level, "this is unexpected." He removed his hat, snow melting from its brim onto the kitchen floor. "Hello, Florence, you're looking well." An awkward silence stretched between them. Once, this man's opinion had meant everything to her. His cruel words, "Who could love a face like that?" had confirmed her deepest fears and driven her further into isolation. Now she felt oddly detached, as if he were a character from a story she'd read long ago. "What brings you back to Timber Creek?" she asked finally, wiping flour from her hands. Jonathan stepped further into the kitchen, his expression difficult to read. "Family business. My father's health is failing." He paused. "I heard about your engagement to Thompson's nephew." Florence nodded, unconsciously touching the pearl ring on her finger. "Yes. We're to be married on Saturday." "He doesn't mind then?" The question was abrupt, almost challenging. "Mind what?" Jonathan gestured vaguely toward her face. "Your condition, the scars." Florence felt a flash of the old hurt, quickly replaced by something like pity. Jonathan Pierce hadn't changed, even if she had. "No," she said simply. "Yates doesn't mind. He sees me, not just my scars." Jonathan's expression shifted to something like regret. "I was young and foolish when I said those things to you, Florence. I've often thought about it since, wondered if I made a mistake." The confession, which might once have meant everything to her, now seemed hollow and self-serving. Florence returned to her cookie dough, rolling it with precise movements. "We all make mistakes, Jonathan. Yours taught me an important lesson about the kind of love worth waiting for." She looked up at him directly, no longer hiding her scarred side. "I'm grateful for that, at least." He seemed taken aback by her calm response, perhaps expecting tears or bitterness. Before he could reply, the kitchen door opened again, and Yates filled the doorway, snow dusting his broad shoulders. "Something smells delicious," he began, then stopped as he noticed Jonathan. His expression cooled, though his voice remained polite. "Mr. Pierce, I heard you were back in town." The tension in the kitchen was palpable as the two men sized each other up. Florence moved to Yates's side, slipping her hand into his in a gesture both reassuring and possessive. "Jonathan was just passing by to offer congratulations on our wedding," she said, the slight emphasis on "our" not lost on either man. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Yes, congratulations. You're a fortunate man, Deputy Sheffield." "I know exactly how fortunate I am," Yates replied, his arm encircling Florence's waist. The gesture was protective without being territorial, and Florence leaned into his solid warmth gratefully. Jonathan nodded awkwardly, replaced his hat, and made his excuses. As the front door closed behind him, Florence released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Are you all right?" Yates asked quietly, studying her face. Florence considered the question honestly. Once, an encounter with Jonathan would have left her shaken, reopening old wounds. Now she felt only a curious sense of closure, as if a chapter had finally ended, allowing a new one to begin. "I'm perfectly all right," she said, and meant it. "He can't hurt me anymore." Yates smiled, understanding in his blue eyes. "No, he can't. But if you wanted me to arrest him on some trumped-up charge anyway, I could probably manage it." Florence laughed, the sound bright in the cozy kitchen. "Tempting, but unnecessary. I'd rather focus on happier things like our wedding." "And these cookies," Yates added, reaching for one cooling on the rack. "A man has priorities, after all." She swatted his hand playfully. "Those are for after dinner. Some lawman you are, stealing cookies in broad daylight." He caught her hand, drawing her closer. "Maybe I need proper incentive to be good." "What sort of incentive did you have in mind?" she asked, her voice softening as he bent toward her. His kiss was her answer, tender and thorough, tasting of snow and promise. When they finally parted, Florence felt a happiness so complete it almost frightened her. "3 more days," Yates murmured against her hair. "Then I get to call you my wife." 3 more days, she echoed, savoring the words and all they represented. Saturday dawned clear and cold. the world outside transformed into a glistening wonderland of snow and ice that sparkled in the winter sunshine. Florence woke early, her stomach fluttering with nervous excitement. By nightfall, she would be Mrs. Yates Sheffield, a transformation more profound than any she could have imagined a year ago. Mrs. Holloway bustled about the boarding house, directing preparations with cheerful authority while Florence bathed and washed her hair. Several of the female boarders, along with Dr. Wilson's wife and the dressmaker who had altered Florence's gown, gathered to help her dress and arrange her hair. "You look absolutely beautiful," Mrs. Wilson declared when Florence finally stood before them in her wedding finery. "Like something from a fairy tale." Florence turned to the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. The ivory satin complemented her dark hair, which had been arranged in soft curls with sprigs of holly and white ribbon woven through it. The high lace collar framed her face elegantly, neither hiding nor emphasizing her scars. "Something old," Mrs. Holloway said, fastening a delicate silver locket around Florence's neck. "This was my mother's. I've always thought of you as the daughter I never had, dear. It would please me if you'd wear it." Tears threatened to spill from Florence's eyes. "Thank you for everything." "Something new," the dressmaker added, indicating the dress itself. "Something borrowed," Mrs. Wilson said, presenting a lace handkerchief. "My grandmother carried this at her wedding. It brought her 50 years of happiness. May it do the same for you." "And something blue," one of the boarders finished, handing Florence a small blue flowered sachet to tuck into her bodice. "Lavender for sweet dreams and calm nerves." Surrounded by the kindness of these women, some friends, some mere acquaintances, Florence felt a sense of belonging she'd almost forgotten was possible. They saw her scars, yes, but they also saw beyond them to the bride, the woman, the friend. The small church was filled to capacity when Florence arrived on Marshall Thompson's arm. Mrs. Holloway had insisted on a proper carriage despite the short distance, and the marshal had stepped in as father figure when it became clear that Florence had no male relatives to give her away. "Nervous?" he asked as they waited for the music to signal their entrance. Florence shook her head, surprising herself with the realization that it was true. "Not about marrying Yates, only about having everyone staring at me." The marshal's weathered face softened. "They'll be staring at a beautiful bride, Florence. Nothing more, nothing less." The music swelled and the church doors opened. Florence took a deep breath and stepped forward on the marshal's arm, her eyes immediately finding Yates waiting for her at the altar. He stood tall and handsome in a new black suit, his blue eyes fixed on her with such love and pride that Florence felt her heart might burst from joy. In that moment, with Yates looking at her as if she were the most beautiful woman in the world, the whispers and stares of the past ceased to exist. There was only this man, this moment, this future opening before her. The ceremony passed in a blur of emotion. Florence was aware of the minister's words, of Yates's hand warm and steady in hers, of the ring being placed on her finger beside her engagement pearl. But most of all, she was aware of the promise being made to love and cherish, in sickness and health, for all the days of their lives. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Yates lifted her veil gently, his eyes meeting hers with tender devotion before he leaned down to seal their vows with a kiss. The church erupted in applause, and Florence felt herself smiling against her husband's lips, overwhelmed by happiness and the sense of coming home. The reception that followed at the hotel dining room was more elaborate than Florence had expected, thanks to Cousin Harriet's generosity and Mrs. Holloway's planning. Even Marshall Thompson had contributed, arranging for a small band from the next town over to provide music for dancing. Florence found herself surrounded by well-wishers, many from families who had kept their distance in the years since her parents' deaths. Some expressions of goodwill seemed more genuine than others, but she accepted all with the same gracious smile, her hand never far from Yates's. "Mrs. Sheffield," he murmured during a quiet moment between dances, the name still new and wonderful on his lips. "How does it feel?" "Like a dream," she admitted, "one I never thought I'd have." His eyes crinkled at the corners, the smile that had first captured her heart now directed at her with all the force of his love. "It's real, Florence. As real as you and me and the life we're going to build together." That life began in earnest the next day when Yates brought his bride home to the small house he'd purchased at the edge of town. It was nothing grand, 2 bedrooms, a parlor, kitchen, and porch, but to Florence, who had lived in a single room at the boarding house for 6 years, it was a palace. "It needs a woman's touch," Yates said as he carried her over the threshold, snow falling gently outside. "But I thought you might enjoy making it our own." Florence walked through the rooms slowly, envisioning curtains at the windows, a garden come spring, children's laughter echoing off the wooden floors. Their children, hers and Yates's, a possibility she'd once thought forever denied to her. "It's perfect," she said, turning to embrace him. Absolutely perfect. The weeks and months that followed were a time of adjustment and discovery. Florence learned that Yates sang off-key while shaving, preferred his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and had nightmares about his time chasing outlaws in Texas. Yates discovered that Florence talked in her sleep, couldn't abide pickles, and still sometimes flinched when strangers stared at her scars for too long. Together, they learned the rhythms of marriage, when to speak and when to listen, how to argue without wounding, the quiet joy of simply existing in the same space. Florence continued to help at the boarding house part-time, and Yates's duties as deputy kept him busy. But their evenings and nights belonged to each other, precious time in which to build the foundation of their life together. Spring came early that year, melting snow into mud and coaxing green shoots from the earth. Florence planted a garden as she dreamed, with Yates's help clearing the ground and building a fence to keep out rabbits. She spent hours on her knees in the dirt, planting vegetables and flowers with equal enthusiasm, her face tilted to the strengthening sun. It was while working in this garden, as April gave way to May, that Florence first suspected she might be with child. The telltale fatigue, the slight nausea in the mornings, the tenderness in her breasts, all signs she recognized from helping deliver Mrs. Wilson's baby the previous summer. She waited a week before sharing her suspicion with Yates, wanting to be more certain before raising his hopes. When she finally told him one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, his reaction was everything she could have wished. "A baby," he whispered, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby," Florence nodded, tears of joy brimming in her eyes. "Doctor Wilson confirmed it today. We should welcome our child around Christmas." Yates gathered her into his arms, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "A Christmas baby," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Best gift I could ever imagine." As her body changed with the growing life inside her, Florence found herself facing new anxieties. What if her child inherited her scars somehow? What if something went wrong during the birth? What if she wasn't a good mother? Yates listened to each fear patiently, offering reassurance without dismissing her concerns. "Our child will be perfect because it's ours," he told her. "And you'll be an amazing mother because you know how precious love is, how it shouldn't be taken for granted." His faith in her, constant and unwavering, gave Florence strength through the discomforts of pregnancy and the increasingly curious stares of townspeople. The first time she felt the baby move a gentle flutter like butterfly wings beneath her ribs, her fears receded, replaced by wonder at the miracle growing within her. Summer passed in a haze of heat and anticipation. Florence sewed tiny garments in the evenings while Yates read aloud from books he'd ordered specially from Denver Stories for their child, poetry for Florence, practical guides to fatherhood for himself. They discussed names, prepared the second bedroom as a nursery, and dreamed aloud about the future. Autumn brought cooler days and increasing activity as they prepared for both the baby and the coming winter. Yates split and stacked firewood until it towered along the side of the house, while Florence preserved garden vegetables and made warm blankets for the cradle Yates had built. As her time grew closer, Florence found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 years of isolation and grief after the fire, believing herself destined for loneliness. Then Yates, with his steady blue eyes and unflinching acceptance, showing her that scars told stories but didn't determine endings. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked one crisp December evening as they sat by the fire, his hand resting on her rounded belly where their child kicked vigorously. Florence smiled, covering his hand with her own. "About how much has changed in a year. Last December, I thought my life was settled, safe but small. I never imagined all this happiness was waiting for me. I knew the moment I met you," Yates said, his eyes warm with love. "There was something about you, Florence, a light that others were too blind to see." She leaned against him, grateful beyond words for this man who had taught her to see herself through new eyes. "I love you, Yates Sheffield, and I love you, Florence Sheffield, both of you." He bent to press a kiss to her stomach, then to her lips. Their daughter arrived 3 days before Christmas, after a long labor that tested Florence's endurance but ultimately ended in triumph and joy. She had Yates's blue eyes and a dusting of dark hair that promised to be as rich as Florence's. They named her Hope, Elizabeth Sheffield Hope, for the feeling she embodied, Elizabeth for Yates's mother. As Florence held her daughter for the first time, marveling at perfect tiny fingers and rosebud lips, she felt a circle closing. The fire that had scarred her body and soul had seemed an ending, a narrowing of possibilities. But it had been merely a chapter in a longer story, one that now included this miracle of new life, this testament to love's healing power. "She's beautiful," Yates whispered, sitting beside them on the bed, his finger caught in their daughter's surprisingly strong grip. "Just like her mother." Florence looked up at him, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain such happiness. "Every scar tells me who you are," he had said that day beneath the blacksmith's awning, words that had begun to heal wounds deeper than those visible on her skin. Now, cradling their daughter while snow fell softly outside, Florence understood the full truth of those words. Her scars had indeed shaped her, but they had never defined her. They were simply part of her story, a story still being written, full of love and hope and possibilities as endless as the stars. They had called her too scarred for love. But Yates Sheffield had seen beyond the scars to the woman beneath, and in doing so, had helped her find her way back to herself. Every day with him was a reminder that true beauty lay in resilience, in kindness, in the courage to open one's heart despite past wounds. As Hope fell asleep in her arms, Florence whispered a silent prayer of gratitude for second chances and unexpected blessings. The journey ahead would have its challenges, she knew, but they would face them together, she and Yates and their daughter, a family forged in love stronger than any fire. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering Timber Creek in a blanket of pristine white. Inside, by the warmth of the fire, Florence Sheffield held her future in her arms and knew at last that she was exactly where she was meant to be.